Okay. Hello, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this ISW Zoom meeting. Um, and we hope this particular talk will be recorded and available on YouTube. And if you're watching this on YouTube, please share the link if you think anyone would be interested in the topic we're discussing tonight. I'd formally like to welcome David Powell, who tweets on X using the handle of European Powell. Um, so you could also find David on X or Twitter as it's formerly known. I personally have come off Twitter, can't stand it anymore, and I'm now using Blue Sky. But you can obviously go to X and Twitter to see David's tweets. Um, David this evening will be talking about the threats that special economic zones and free ports pose for people in the UK and indeed around the world. This is a relatively new phenomenon. I'm sure David will go into more detail. Relatively new phenomena where governments essentially create these special zones where they suspend local democracy. Local democracy has no role in them. They affect workers' rights, health and safety, and nature and environmental protections are removed to enable effectively a free rein for industries and companies to set up and operate. And I understand that there are 74 special economic zones and 12 free ports are being proposed or were proposed by the last Tory government. And the current Labour government is continuing with those proposals. So we very much look forward, David, to you going into much more detail about the consequences of this for Britain and indeed Europe and wider in the world, and the underlying economic philosophies behind these developments. So, David, welcome, and over to you.
Hey, thank you so much for inviting me to tonight's discussion. Um, yes, I just got back from Liverpool. A group called Left Unite and the pensioners of Merseyside, who are amazing, radical group of pensioners on the left who flew me over to Liverpool to talk to their groups about SEZs and Freeports. Um, I wanted to add that I'm not just on Twitter, I am also European Pal on Blue Sky and European Pal on Substack. Substack, you can write like basically articles. So it's three platforms, and often with Substack, you get more content, that kind of thing. And of course, I mean, if you know my threads on Twitter, they can be very long too, but it's always nicer to talk face to face. And online Zoom, that's good. I learned how to do that during COVID, but I much prefer being in a room with people, really face to face. So anyway, here we go. What I want to do is talk about SEZs and Freeports. I'm going to talk about what you won't see on the many council and corporate websites that are backing Sunak and Keir Starmer's nationwide rollout of 74 deregulated SEZs and 12 Freeports. I will go into what is the difference between a Freeport and an SEZ. I will talk about the ideology of them. I will explain why Brexit was necessary to take the UK out of the EU to avoid regulations pertaining to state aid in the EU. I will tell you all these things, and I've got it all my notes are ready, so I'm ready to go. So again, thank you guys for having me here. Okay, let's get into it. This is going to probably take about 20 minutes to half an hour, so please bear with me. Happy to do a Q&A at the end. Okay, so you would think that the UK mainstream media would be on top of exposing the true nature of councils and companies embroiled in the setup of free zones. The complexity of free zones is their camouflage, which needs proper and urgent scrutiny. The public and their respective communities are not being sufficiently informed about the impacts of deregulated free zones which are being implemented not just in the UK but around the world, notably outside of Europe mostly, because deregulation is king. Okay, so at their worst, free zones remove the obstacles of regulation and democracy for profit gains at the expense of local community infrastructure and preservation of the environment. What is a special economic zone? An SEZ is a designated region freed from the host country's regulations, including suspension of the rule of law, which is then tailored for financial gains and extraction purposes, be that minerals or fossil fuels, and generally all kind of workers' rights and surveillance and things like this. It all comes into it. Private security. I'll go into a little bit more detail later. Corporations are trusted to self-regulate inside the boundaries of the SEZ, meaning they can create their own rules. Now, this is known as Adam Smith's invisible hand, something the EU implicitly rejects as antithetical to the single market. So SEZs can house a freeport, an airport, whole towns, entire cities, and rural areas under a private slash public governed authority. The thing you get to find out about this kind of relationship between private and public is that everything is completely geared towards the profits of the private sector. So, for instance, in Teesside, Sunak's flagship Brexit Freeport, the ratio of profits going to the private sector over the public sector is 9 to 10 in favor of the private sector. Okay. Um, so like I said, the UK's 74 SEZs range from 34 to 75 kilometers in diameter. So, for example, the Liverpool SEZ, which I talked about last week with the Left Unity, includes its Freeport. That's approximately 45 kilometers in diameter. So SEZs, they are expansionist by nature. So businesses notoriously chase 10-year corporate tax breaks. That time was that duration of the tax breaks was set by Jeremy Hunt, former Chancellor under Rishi Sunak. He also set the licenses of these free zones, all 86 of them, 12 free ports and 74 SECs, for 25 years. And along with that comes a whole raft of deregulations that basically totally favor the private sector. So companies inside the boundaries of the SEZs compete in an unlevel playing field without contributing anything to communities other than job displacement, modern day slavery, environmental pollution, and badly made products. So think of an SEZ as a room within a room or a state within a state. So if you think of the UK, there's 48 SEZs in England, there are 18 SEZs in Scotland and 8 in Wales. Um, and of course, there are 8 free ports in England, 2 in Scotland, and 2 in Wales. So we're looking at the kind of the carving up of the country into smaller, more manageable regions. And this is something that is key to why yeah, we will talk about anarcho-capitalists and libertarians and neoliberals. They've basically fused over the last 70 years, and diluted some of their more radical leanings to agree on, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to get rid of democracy, and you do it by basically carving up the country into smaller, more manageable areas, which they say will render those areas under localized freedoms. Now, this is what Keir Starmer has gone and done when about 2 weeks ago he announced to 700 corporate lobbyists. So, for example, from Deloitte, DP World, BlackRock, Peel Group, who own Manchester and Liverpool, basically. He's said to them, okay, I'm going to give you governance powers of governance now. And our government, we will take a secondary position in that. So this is what I mean about self-regulation inside the smaller SEZs. Okay. Um, I'm gonna I'm gonna tell you now about a difference about the free ports and SEZ. So what is a free port? Traditionally, a port is publicly owned and regulated and deals mainly with transshipment, importing and exporting goods around the world. Publicly owned ports come under port governance, where local control over port infrastructure prevents profiteering. Freeports in the UK are privately owned. That's why they're called free ports. So you've got free speech, free cities, free zones, free enterprise, and you've got free ports. Nothing about this is free. It's just a kind of gloss to make you think, oh, this is great, but it's not. It's bad for normal people, ordinary citizens. It's great for corporations, okay? Free ports, they come with relaxed laws and by extension, relaxed enforcement of those laws. So all 12 free ports, every one of them, the 8 in England, the 2 in Scotland, the 2 in Wales, they sit inside the surrounding expansionist SEZ, Special Economic Zone. In terms of what free ports can achieve, and what I'm telling you now is a mixture of my own research into incredible authors and investigative journalists like Matt Kennard, Claire Provost, Quinn Slobodian, and I can give a little book reading list at the end of this. But in terms of what they can achieve, I mean, this is a lot of this is also coming from the government's website. You can go on the government website and you can see they've got a whole, bunch of articles on why Thatcher set up SEZs in the 1980s, why they failed, basically because of being in the EU, and why they were resurrected and turbocharged after Brexit. So, as I said, let me just find where I am. So Freeports in the wrong hands share similarities, and I'm not being dramatic with this, with organized crime syndicates. So illegal activity comes in numerous forms, and I'll list them for you now. There's weapons trading, there's drugs, there's stolen art, there's private banking, there is the moving and storing of gold, there is money laundering, there is human trafficking, and the scrapping of minimum wage and human rights abuses. This is what can go on in deregulated free zones. UK free ports are privately owned and run by standalone corporations with a future scope and incentive to expand into the surrounding SEZ territory. All UK SEZs and free ports were set up with secondary legislation, which means pretty much zero parliamentary and public scrutiny. We have to consider who is set to gain from these SEZs. So, like I said before, you've got Peel Group, you have got BlackRock, which is the most criminally corrupt shadow bank in the whole world, and they basically own everything. So, why are they interested in free zones? This is about private equity making incursions now into the public sector. It also includes, and I found this out 2 days ago, BlackRock, in the partnership with Keir Starmer's government, are now moving into natural assets. And this comes with a long paper from Labour about, what did they call it? I will just dig it up. Um, Let me just find that. It's a paper on, they called it a national conversation on land use. And this was released in February, well, just last week or so, February 2025. And it becomes clear that nature, so the green areas, are to become tradable on a universal, a global ledger via blockchain. So the new natural infrastructure that is now being unlocked is about moving nature into a debt-riven corporate model or racket. Of course, under the guise of being green and with, Rachel Reeves' mantra of sustainable economic growth. So I think this is extremely disturbing. The whole language that is surrounding what assets are for traditionally for companies like BlackRock, which is in essentially the financial system, the financial infrastructure. But now they're moving into what they call, like I just said, natural assets or nature's economy. It's absolutely obscene. So this is, like I said, this is under the guise of Labour's rollout of building 1.5 million houses in the space of their term in office. So I'm just gonna go back to my notes. Sorry about this. It takes let me just find myself. Yeah, bear with me. So yeah, the next thing I want to talk about is the numbers. So I've told you about the numbers of the SEZs, but I also want to give you some figures, some financial figures. Before that, I want you to know that bidding on all the free zones of the UK took place between 2021 and 2022. So this is when Truss and Sunak rolled out this. I don't know if you remember Truss going on about full fat investment zones, and I was like, "What the hell is that?" Started digging into it, and it's just one horror upon horror. But the key thing that really pissed me off was that Labour MPs, mayors, councillors, lords, and baronesses were active board members of Sunak and Truss nationwide rollout in a Freeports SEZ consortia. Now, each SEZ receives, so there's 74, remember, 160 million in state aid. So multiply that by 74, that equals 11 billion 840 million pounds. Each Freeport, there's 12 of them, receives 25 million seed capital, which is private investment. Notice how much lower that is than the SEZ rollout. State aid is public money. Multiply by 12, that's 300 million. But of note, Sunak's flagship Brexit SEZ Freeport at Teesside has already spent 560 million of taxpayers' money. Profits are split 9 to 10 in favour of the private sector. So when we look at those figures, you might think, my God, that's an astronomical sums of money, but it's not actually big enough for long-term investment. But what it is good enough is a short-term boom and bust approach. So, what is the difference between Freeport's SEZs in the EU and the UK? Now, I told you that Freeports are privately owned. Ports in the EU are publicly owned, okay? And the SEZs are strictly regulated. And what it comes down to is state aid. Now, you can look on the Institute of Government's website, you can look on the UK government's website on what they have to say about state aid. So, as I said earlier, Thatcher and Geoffrey Howe set up, I think it's something like 38, 39 SEZs. But they came up against the EU's regulations on state aid, which is to not use public money for profit motives. So if we link that back to the bidding period between 2021 and 2022 with a cross-party, consortia signing off on all these new resurrected free zones, turbocharged after Brexit, the basic thing is that the EU says no, you cannot give public money for profit to corporations because this will fragment and distort the EU's protective single market, the integrity of the single market. So what happened in that bidding process is lots of companies went to via to the Tories and they said, "Yeah, we'll have a piece of that pie, please. We're in." So that was the whole bidding process. Now understand that Labour, so mayors like Andy Burnham, Steve Rotherham, mayors around the country, there were lords and baronesses. I've got extensive maps not made by me, but made by some of my fellow researchers. And when you see these maps on our Miro boards, it is staggering the amount of overlap between corporations, councils, and various stakeholders, some of whom they're all from all over the world, basically. It's insane. So, what I think is going on is that the state aid issue is why Keir Starmer says there will be no rejoining the EU in my lifetime, right? So I don't know how old he is now, 60 something. So he's saying, 25 years. And I told you the licenses for the free zones are 25 years in duration. So that's why he says there'll be no rejoining the EU. Absolutely this. It all comes down to state aid. And I mean, I've experienced people, commentators saying, no, it's not that, but it's in black and white on the UK government's website and on the Institute for Government's website. And if you follow me on Twitter, you will see those, those screenshots from the website, and I explain what is going on there. So Labour, along with the Tories, they know that Brexit has rendered the UK basically capital hungry and desperate for growth. That's why Rachel Reeves keeps banging on about growth, 24 hours a day. So when I refer to the Unity Party, I call them the duopoly. They are selling off UK sovereignty and vast swaths of territories to foreign capitals such as BlackRock, DP World, Peel Group, Deloitte, ExxonMobil, Charles Koch, corporations, all these corporations, they have atrocious track records in fraud, tax evasion, human rights abuses, on-site fatalities, environmental pollution, all the while perpetuating basically a 40-year-old lie that is foreign direct investment. So foreign direct investment, it's got two forms: physical plants and new buildings, or foreign purchases from existing companies. So politicians such as Rachel Reeves and Jeremy Hunt, they are known to confuse these two forms of FDI under the rhetoric of economic growth and Britain being the best place in the world to invest. So as SEZs and Freeports become operational, corporate governance begins at pace. I told you earlier that 2 weeks ago there's a webinar by Starmer where he invited 700 corporate lobbyists and told them, look, basically, you've got the governance powers now. We're just going to take a back seat. So what does that mean for public services? Public services, and I've been reading a lot of yeah, there are these kind of private governance consultancies run by people like Michael Castle Miller, Patrick Friedman, who's the grandson of Milton Friedman, who was Thatcher's favorite economist. You've got Peter Thiel, Peter Thiel of Palantir. You have got Mark Lutter. I think he's from the IEA, the Institute of Economic Affairs. So all this kind of this network of interests, of global interests, they come under an umbrella group formed in 1981 called the Atlas Network, right? The Atlas Network is a think tank that creates think tanks. This comes from originates around 1955, and another economist called Friedrich Hayek, again on the right, and he suggested to a man called Anthony Fisher in 1955, look, if you want to, I would suggest you set up a think tank, okay? But you do not disclose to the public what your partisan interests are because you will lose your charity status. The IEA has been running now for something like 70 plus years. They've been incubating these kind of what were once known as radical fringe fantasies about exit, right? About chopping up a country into small, more manageable zones under localized freedoms. But now we're here. We're here now. We're here with Brexit. It's in the word exit. Exit from democracy, exit from regulation, exit from the EU's protectionism, exit from workers' rights, environmental responsibility, all these things incubated for 70 plus years. So, the other thing I want to dig into now is something called compulsory purchase orders. So, when the Tories put up that web page on the government, which is about SEZs and Freeports, they also Michael Gove he kept updating the page, and he included a section on compulsory purchase orders. I was horrified to read this, but compulsory purchase orders, he said, were being updated. And compulsory purchase is when the government can basically seize business property, agricultural property, and residential property for, economic growth. Just get it. So if you own your home, you are in direct danger of having it seized by the government to facilitate, zone expansion and economic growth. Now, Labour in October 2024, they released a 192-page document solely dedicated to compulsory purchase orders. You can read it. It's on the government's website. I've posted it dozens of times on my various three social media platforms. And that came at more or less at the same time when Keir Starmer did a tweet, casually tweeting, the Labour Party is now in partnership, a government partnership with BlackRock. Now, BlackRock has long peddled the idea of public-private partnerships for infrastructure. So if you think back to Tony Blair and PFI, this has now accelerated to an extremely, very urgent and dangerous level. It's nothing compared to what PFI was. I told you earlier that libertarians and anarcho-capitalists, they've all kind of come together now and agreed this is the route we're going to take. So to them, public services, they deem them small potatoes. They don't mean anything to these people. So once you set up a zone, and this is also linked with why, especially in England, 100 and actually another 192 figure, the same as the length of the document of the compulsory purchase orders. 192 councils in England now have higher debt rates than Birmingham. Birmingham was issued with an S114 notice in 2024, I believe, which is technical bankruptcy. Now, people don't know this, but Birmingham is host to six SEZs, right? Um, Another article that I found on The Guardian, the headline is like 6,000 homeowners in Birmingham are underneath a mass compulsory purchase order. The same thing is also happening in Cornwall. Cornwall is host to 16 SEZs, right? I think there's 16 SEZs in also in Norfolk and Suffolk. This is why the highest number of these zones are in England. So if you look at a map, there's a map I've posted a few times of the UK, and you will see it's dated 2012, right? 2012. All the regions are they're outlined as being special economic zones. Okay, so that's in 2012. So then they knew what they were doing way before Brexit. This is why the think tanks are on hand to just constantly, tell them, look, this is the way it's going to go. We have to find some way to extricate ourselves from the EU. We've been looking at exit strategies for since the 1950s and the 1960s because we despise the social contract. We absolutely despise the idea that, ordinary people, my parents, my grandparents could afford a house. I can't afford a house. My friends, my students who I teach, and graduate, they can't afford a house either. So the zone is this place where all public services, they are wiped out, right? Absolutely. Now, what a lot of people also don't know is that Freeports and SEZs are stepping stones to the next thing, the end game. The end game is free cities, right? They are known as charter cities. Now, this goes back to the year 1600 with the East India Company, which again was when Britain colonized India and set up dozens and dozens of free ports and special economic zones there. Then into the 1850s, they colonized Hong Kong and Singapore. And again, they set up loads of SEZs and free ports, and they brought with them their own courts, their own minimum wage, and their own kind of schools, their own education systems, and of course the courts. So I've read this thing that they say if you can change the law, you win the war. Right? So the law is really crucial, and this is why exiting was about changing those laws that protect ordinary citizens. Now, I'm going to tell you another thing that most people have no idea about. You will not see any of this on the MSM. So, what I call zone fever was basically smuggled inside the Brexit Trojan horse. The transition period we are going through now, which is going to be a 25-year long period, is preparing the UK for total privatization. And it gets worse. What is ISDS and LCIA? Investor State Dispute Settlement, ISDS, allows corporations to sue governments for billions in damages when a corporation believes its rights have been infringed upon, such as polluting the environment, shredding workers' rights, and making faulty products. The ISDS, Investor State Dispute Settlement, is a secret corporate justice court that was set up by the World Bank in 1966. Its committee has 3 members, none of whom have a law degree, right? Now, ISDS is written into all those CPTPP Trans-Pacific free trade deals, that the Tories were saying this is brilliant, we don't need the EU anymore. We know that the kind of dividends or, the returns are something like 0.43% over a period of 20 years or something like this. So again, we're getting these big figures, these long durational phases, and this is the transition phase, okay? Now, there is a ISDS, as I said, was written into the CPTPP deals. There is another mechanism called the London Court of International Arbitration, which is LCIA. Now, that is the thing that has been written into all of Wales's licenses, Scotland's licenses, and England's licenses with the Freeports and the SECs. I've done my research, it is absolutely in there, okay? So what's the ideology behind Freeports and SECs? Like I said, it goes back to 1600, then cycling through to the 1850s. Now, there's something that struck me about this that in China, this was referred to as China's century of humiliation. So what's going on now is that people, back in the 80s and the early 90s, people like Geoffrey Howe, the Tories, Norman Tebbit, all these, insane libertarian lunatics thought, let's bring this back onto ourselves because what we see, what we benchmark as economic success for the few in Singapore, in Shenzhen, in these charter cities all around the world, that's going to work for Britain, right? This is why the kind of wealth tax thing is something Labour now will not touch because the money is going to those corporations who are given powers of governments to set up shop in those special economic zones. So, there was a phrase, I think it was, what's his name? Alan Walter, who was one of Thatcher's, well, I'll say henchmen. And they said, look, but someone interviewing him said, look, don't you think um, that democracy was the obstacle that had to be removed for this economic success? And he smiled and says, yes, that's exactly what we want. We want to change the UK into one, basically one big tax zone. Okay. So as I said earlier, there is another step after free ports and SECs, and that is charter cities, free cities. So this is when a kind of a type of city in which a guarantor from another foreign developed country would create a city within the developing host country. So the public now, you are basically, state aid is public money. You are paying for the privatization of your own towns, rural areas, and cities. Earlier, I mentioned this new development with the natural assets. Private equity is been founded on its on financial assets, and then basically, they prey on smaller companies, asset strip them, and then they resell them on, and that's where they make their money. They don't care about long term anything like this. So this kind of nature as an asset, that is just next level insanity. Um, I don't know how much time I've got left, but the same thing. Look,
About
a free
about
port.
5 minutes. About
Okay,
5 minutes.
fantastic. I'm nearly there. I'm nearly there. So basically, a free port, an SEZ, and a charter city, they are all variations of this kind of corporate, serious corporate incursions into the public sector. They're doing it step by step, right? And that's about all I have to say on it. I've got loads more notes, and I'm hoping I get some questions now, and we can dig in and maybe start to, talk about it. But thank you.
Thank you, David. I think that we will have a short break now, if I
Yeah.
may. That will give you a chance for you to have a break as well.
I'll go make some tea.
Make some tea, or a whiskey or whatever you takes your
Yeah,
fancy, and we'll come back at what time is it? 41. If we come back at 9:50, give it 10 minutes.
fine.
So if everybody wants to have a break and come back in 10 minutes, is that okay?
Okay, see
So
you later.
if you want to switch off your cameras, you can.
Yeah.
If you want to stay, if people want to stay, or when people come back, if you unmute, we can have a chat. People can informally chat amongst themselves until we start in 10 minutes.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Welcome back, everybody, to the second half of this Zoom meeting with David Powell, and which is now an open session, really. If everyone would like to mute again as before, just so, but if you indicate, I can unmute. I think I can unmute people or ask you to unmute if you want to speak. So if who wants to kick off with a question or contribution to the discussion? Gabriel, you're first in.
Well, I didn't really want to. Oh, sorry. No,
you
can hear
muted
me, can
yourself.
you?
Yeah, we can
Yeah.
hear you now. You muted yourself for a short while.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't really want to start off, but I will do because I put my hand up. Yeah, a couple of things. One is a comment that was actually raised by the speaker anyway on the sort of, if you like, the prehistory of or the history of free trade and that, which clearly after the Corn Law was sort of repealed and free trade became the policy in Britain and that, then they started forcing that on European countries. Our manufacturers should be able to, you know, take in British manufacturers. And obviously the question of free trade zones in India, in Hong Kong, after the Boxer Rebellion, particularly I think there were, was it 8 or 10 countries invaded China, and but before that the glorious British involvement in the Opium Wars,
Yes.
British imperial sort of policy and that. So that's a long history. The other question I'd like to ask is the EU policy on free trade, which I mean they say that it, you know, I think there was a paper came out from the EU in 2023 where they said there were 5,000 free trade zones in the country. I'm not sure whether they were ports or zones or whatever, but and that 20% of them were in the EU, which means 1,000 were in the EU. I mean, Britain's catching up. I mean, given the size of Britain compared, and obviously, I think we've probably got worse policy than that. But can you say something about the impact, the negative impact on, say, working class conditions and environmental conditions in the EU?
Well, first of all, there's 82 free zones in the EU. They are SEZs and ports, so they're not free ports. It's not fight. There are, I think you might be referring to after the financial crash in 2008.
Yeah.
SEZs there was a boom in SEZs, which is about basically trying to build a second empire, after imperialism and all that. So there are over 5,400 SEZs globally, the majority of which are in the US and Asia and Africa, couple in Australia and New Zealand. But the EU is, in comparison, there's the smallest ratio of SEZs in the EU. There's only 82. Okay. So in terms of like you asked me a question about the impacts in the EU. As far as, I mean, if you go on, there's a page dedicated to state aid in the EU's SEZs, and they spell out that they actually say quite a lot of things. They say it was their use of SEZs was to support newer member states who from more less developed economies, to give them a boost, and there was a big emphasis on that state aid was a temporary lift to countries that who joined the EU that weren't like Poland and that kind of thing. So, but again, a temporary thing that was if they, I mean, on the site they go into. I referred to earlier as Adam Smith's invisible hand, which is the EU directly spell this out that they refuse to adopt this self-regulatory approach of companies in SEZs. That's why the state aid thing is so important, that it's not a profit motive for companies. So the biggest thing is state aid, and of course, all these, regulations that Brexit has after Brexit is now doing. I mean, you have to look at the constant flow of stories. I mean, even last week there was something like a story about, I think in February of this, January or February of this year, there were 10 tons of diseased meat being imported into Dover. There's a great a little short film about, I don't know if you know, what's her name? The farm woman, Liz. Oh, she's great. What's her name? Webster. You can go on Liz Webster on Twitter, and she's posting these. She's also on YouTube, and she posts videos about, she's monitoring, the imports, how bad, imports are coming into there's all these stories of diseased meat and diseased plants, and that the infrastructure that Brexiteers said they would put in at the checkpoints, it's nowhere near operational standard for full checks. The money being allocated for it is too small. So, you have to really watch what you're eating now. And you have to watch what kind of plants you're getting as well. And it's just the whole range of things. So that's the big difference. So if there are bad imports coming from within the EU, it's probably because some, criminal outlet thinks, okay, we can send these things to the UK because there's no checks. They know it. There's organized crime. Now, I just wanted to pick you up on like Rotterdam port. It's something like 45 kilometers. I think it's a huge port, massive. I've been there myself. Um, Now that is known as the cocaine, officially known as the cocaine kind of hub of the world. Now that is in a regulated free port. So just imagine how bad things are going to get in a deregulated free port.
Thank you very
I
much.
hope that answers the question, yeah?
Yeah, it does. Good point. Yeah.
Thank
you.
Is there anybody else that wishes to ask a question? If not, I'm going to come in. Nobody else is. Oh, Nigel, if you unmute, if you,
Can you hear me now?
yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, good, because I didn't do anything. Okay. Can I ask a question to David Powell? Playing devil's advocate, can you come up with any justification for Freeports and SEZs which could possibly benefit the common man or woman?
No, no. And I'm going to refer you also to, do you know the tax expert Richard Murphy?
Yes.
He was on Twitter. He's very prolific. He's fantastic insight into yeah, basically taxes and tax evasion and Brexit. And he's done a number of interviews about Freeports and SEZs. His most recent talk was about charter cities because he knows that's the next step after Freeports and SEZ. Now, he has said he cannot find one single economic benefit to ordinary people with Freeports and SEZs. Not one. So there's a whole list. If you can go on the government website, and one of the main things they, on the glossy brochure version of websites and LEPs, local, enterprise and Freeport entities, their websites will tell you how fantastic Freeports and SEZs are going to be, but they're only giving you the glossy brochure version. Now, I know from talking with my little network in the UK, people like Jim Funnell, Liz Webster, Richard Murphy, these kind of people. Now, when you sent a lot of FOI requests, Freedom of Information requests, have been sent to the numerous councils and Freeport SEZ entities. And a couple of things have happened. First of all, those FOI requests come back either heavily redacted because of commercially sensitive information, or they don't even bother replying. Okay, so I want to go back to, there's something called job displacement. Jobs displacement, that is mentioned on the UK government's website, is something where so a free zone is set up and it attracts people from outside of the zone, from say a poorer area, right? And they will flock to that zone in searching for, better work, better jobs, but it's a complete illusion. Job displacement then is a vicious cycle because people who leave one area, that means that area then goes into further ruin. and all surrounding areas outside these special economic zones. It's a known pattern where they cannot compete with, the corporate kind of monopoly that goes on inside the free zones. It's completely unsustainable. But also, what else is unsustainable? I mentioned those figures, like the 160 million being given to companies in SEZs. It's about enough for a boom and bust approach within the SEZ. So, like I said, surrounding economies, they will basically wither, atrophy, and collapse. Now, when the companies in these zones have had their fill, because they are notoriously known for chasing tax breaks for the 10 years, and when that deadline is over, they will move out of that zone and go somewhere else. Now, that is also to say that the jobs and the promises of thousands and thousands of jobs, you could, again, look on the government's website. There is there was overwhelming evidence that the promises of new jobs just completely were out of proportion with the estimated targets of the Freeport, the whole ideology. And this was recorded via Thatcher, with Thatcher, and that is when the zones were actually, we were in the EU back then. So they weren't even working then. So the only reason they are going to work is in what you call libertarian neoliberal terms, right? They're only going to work for those corporations. So the people who are looking for a better life and they move to those zones, first of all, their hometowns are going to just collapse, right? Like talking about those councils that are all collapsing, 192 in England. Talking about the compulsory purchase orders. It's all linked. Now, the whole complex, this is why we really need to kind of have a national discussion across all zones, all these designated zones, all the people entrapped in these zones. It's as if you've got, I made a comparison earlier this week to a zone being a bit like an island, and that when a zone has got kind of super surveillance and private security and no unions, no worker representation, nothing like this, you're basically trapped in that zone. You cannot leave and go to another zone because you don't have the means to do so, right? You won't have the means to do so. You cannot afford it. So this is this, if playing devil's advocate, you said, um, there's reams of evidence that these zones, they don't do anything. And the green zones that we're hearing a lot about, two in Scotland, two in Wales, they've just added the word green to Freeport to make it sound more palatable to the public. Because a lot of those, like the wind farm things that they did not need, they were already going ahead. They were going ahead in the EU. They absolutely did not need Freeport status to operate. So this whole, the moment you start just looking in and looking into the details of what this whole thing is, it completely falls apart. And you will notice that in the mainstream media, all those stories you see about welfare cuts and two-child cap and the water companies and the obscene profits they are making, just magnify that by about 100 times and apply it to every single aspect of public infrastructure that you pay your taxes for to make sure they are functioning. That's all going. It's horrific. It's absolutely horrific. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes,
Right. Okay.
it's sort of what I was expecting in a way,
Yeah.
but worse.
It's way worse. And
Mm.
like I said earlier, there are these mechanisms of the, secret corporate justice courts that apply to those contracts. So this is, like I said earlier, this is when a company says its rights to pollute and shred workers' rights. This is why they want to get out of the ECHR, have been breached. They've breached the contract. So this is why, I'll give you an example. In Honduras, in South America, there was a company called Prospera. Prospera Capital was funded by Peter Thiel, who also set up Palantir, okay, with the NHS, and they got a 430 million contract for data harvesting of patients. Now, the only reason they're doing that, and I mean, it was a spy tech company, okay, for the CIA, and the only reason they are and I've got a book here you can read called Peter Thiel, The Contrarian. You will see how bad this man is and how powerful this man who operates in the shadows is. This man is a lunatic, but he has the power and the money. Now he is funding what he calls what we call governance consultants, private governance consultancy agencies like Locus Economica, Prospera. Now there's another man called Shankar Singham, who is known as the architect of Brexit. Shankar Singham. He is a US-born trade lawyer. Now he was at the signing off ceremony in Wales with the former Prime Minister Mark Drakeford, who signed off on 8 special economic zones and 2 free ports in Wales. He was there in Ynys Môn. He signed off. You can see a picture of him holding a £600 check for a high school in Ynys Môn, Shankar Singham. And I met him a few years ago when I was living in London. He was working at a law firm in London, what's it called, Baker and McKenzie. And I met him, and he was already weird back then, and everyone thought he was weird. But he's set up something called Babson Global, which is a college faculty in the US, and it's dedicated to developing what he calls the deregulatory framework that he would then, ship out to governance consultancies all around the world. Like he was responsible for, Thatcher's and privatizing electricity and all the energy services. He also did the same in Russia. So it's like these people, they operate in the shadows. They have extraordinary access to our politicians. And this is why, there's not enough has been done to expose places like Tufton Street and the IEA and that kind of conglomeration of very highly right-wing think tanks. And the other disgusting thing is that these think tanks now, they have been turned like Policy Exchange and what's the other one? Yeah, the IEA. They've been singing the praises and attending Keir Starmer's, investment summits, right? The recent one last year. They're there. Adam Smith Institute was there. So you're like, it's just gone, it's just up. This is why Morgan McSweeney, he expunged the left from the Labour Party. There's a fantastic book here called The Starmer Project by Oliver Eagleton. It's a very short book, but it just goes into detail about what happened to the Labour left and why Morgan McSweeney is basically the kind of doppelganger of Dominic Cummings. It's a fantastic little book. Might as well show you. I might as well show you the other books I've got as well.
Sorry, can I ask the publisher?
Yes, the publisher is. Let me see. Verso.
Can somebody else get a word in?
Yeah.
Because some of us would like to actually ask some questions or make some comments. So the first thing to comment about is that the idea of the special economic zones is far from new. It's been around 30 years. Naomi Klein first wrote about it in 1999 after the World Trade Organization protests of that year. Now, I believe that you're right in saying this was the flavor of capitalism for a long time. And it was about globalization.
Yeah.
The interesting thing, I believe, is that capitalism is actually shifting shape. And it's shifting shape. You'll probably have your own ideas about how it's shifting shape. But it's shifting shape. It's begun to sort of think less about special economic zones and making whole countries economic zones. You're saying that, actually, you have said that. I recognize you've said that, but it's actually the way it is going. It's saying that a whole country should be free of taxation, should be unleashed. Business, capitalism, whatever, should be unleashed in a whole country.
Yeah.
And Trump is an exponent of that. He doesn't care about special economic zones in this country or in the Far East or wherever you want to have special economic zones. He is interested in the US being a special economic zone. And he said things like, shut down your industries. I don't care about you having industries anywhere else in the world. Bring your investment here.
Mm-hmm.
The only way in which we will trade with you is if you send your investment to the States. In other words, is saying the whole of the States is an economic zone. It's a really sort of combination of economic, this sort of outlook for whole countries combined with nationalism, combined with other aspects of totalitarian, authoritarian control. That's all I've got to say.
Yeah,
I'm going to watch the football in a minute.
You're absolutely right. And as I said earlier, Freeports, SEZs, they are the stepping stones to basically
Yeah, you did say
whole
that.
nations being turned into tax havens and under kleptocratic rule. So, I believe we are living through this, what I call the transition phase now after Brexit.
Yeah, sure.
And there is another dimension to, I don't know if you've read Techno-Feudalism by Yanis Varoufakis, which is a new development of capitalism, which is basically in the digital sphere. So he talks about people like Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk, and that these people, when every click you make on a website or every purchase you make via Amazon, they take 40% rent of that. And as far as I know, that is not taxed. That is just extra money that they get, and they make billions. And apparently, the digital sphere is still in its kind of infancy in terms of regulation. So that's why you've got this whole crazy volatile system, which I often link to the gold standard, which was also very volatile. But this is now a new form. And techno-feudalism, it sounds like a mouthful, but it's basically, it's a new form of feudalism.
Throw in cryptocurrency.
There you go. Yeah. Yeah.
I've got to leave.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Thank you very much indeed.
Tony,
thanks, David.
And
thanks.
I'll see you later.
Thanks.
Yeah. Anybody else want to make a contribution?
You're in the East Midlands, right? So like, Wellingborough, that is, you've got a major SEZ there. Yeah.
Have we got an SEZ here?
Absolutely. You can see, I've just looked at it on the government website.
Where is it?
It says East Midlands. It's actually the whole of it's the West Midlands, West Yorkshire, East Midlands, Tees Valley, South Yorkshire, the Northeast, and of course, Great Manchester and Liverpool. It's the whole of England is now a plethora of zones. They'll all be competing with one another at some point.
Yeah.
Just go on the UK.
Wondering where they are in Northamptonshire, because I know this Wellingborough has had an enterprise zone since the early 1980s, but that's finished now, and was relatively limited in its scope. I think people just didn't have to pay rent for 10 years, rates for 10 years. I think that was the incentive, and the local council provided the infrastructure of buildings and roads and what have you, and then industries were encouraged to move here on the basis that they were exempt from rates.
Yeah, and I think there's also some concessions on the buildings which were then owned by the council, but have since been all sold off to the sitting tenants. Yeah,
but I'm not aware of an SEZ in Northamptonshire. But I may be wrong.
I mean, it's got here the East Midlands. Where are the investment zones? I'm on the government website now, and it lists East Midlands Combined County Authority as an SEZ.
Yeah, a question I was going to ask. I mean, Labour have just put out their proposals for local government reorganisation to try and create bigger single tier authorities And I mean, Northamptonshire is not in that. I think they were rejected as part of a consortium.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, I'm just here on the site, and it says the East Midlands Investment Zone will create jobs and drive growth in the advanced manufacturing and clean energy sectors. Key locations include Infinity Park in Derby, Explore Park in Worksop, Hartington, Staveley. Tax releases available on all these designated sites. The East Midlands Investment Zone is supported by local business and research partners, including the University of Derby, University of Nottingham, and Nottingham Trent University.
Yeah.
And they say they want to create 4,300 jobs with around 380 million of private investment over the next 10 years. So, there are these different figures that one moment you're hearing we know that it's 160 million per SEZ for all the 74. But you go on the government website and they keep changing it and updating it, and you just keep seeing new figures and new developments. I know that business rates are suspended, and I know that national insurance contributions are also out, and that basically it's something like zero corporate tax for 10 years.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, I think we perhaps need to look into what's happening in our local patch here. But the question I wanted to ask you is, what do we do about these developments? I mean,
that's a really good question.
It seems as that these are wider. The way they can be opposed is on a wider political basis. It's opposing the far right. It's opposing the Trump. It does seem, though, a huge task, because as you say, they're kind of doing it by stealth. And it's all within the terms of growth and freeing up regulations. I mean, the Starmer's talking about, the red tape, doing away with red tape. And these are all Tory ideas that Labour now seem to have adopted. So it's really quite depressing, because there's certainly for the next 4 years, there's no real political opposition to this, certainly in Parliament. Are there examples where people have successfully opposed an SEZ and or an SEZ is eventually closed down as a result of local opposition? Is there any examples of
I mentioned Honduras
in opposing these developments?
Okay, so I mentioned in Honduras, the reason why the SEZ from Prospera, Peter Thiel-backed company, Prospera Capital, was shut down. And incidentally, you should know that Rishi Sunak studied at Stanford University, and his mentor was a man called Paul Romer. And Paul Romer lectured on a return to colonialism via SEZs and charter cities. So that's where, Sunak got the idea from. In terms of examples of when these SEZs are closed down, they're either closed down because they're not long-term enough and the corporations just make their money and then sod off to the next available zone, wherever that is in the world, and they just leave behind the damage and the bills for things like the cleanup campaigns that the public then has to pay. So, it's basically like a firework that is shining and, bursting out, and then it goes away and you're left with the mess to clear it up. So, like I said, the Honduran SEZ by Prospera and Peter Thiel, that was an idea that Paul Romer developed, but he came up against all kinds of obstacles. Obstacles that he refers to as the socialist democratic government of Honduras, that they opposed it, and the Supreme Court of Honduras shut down the Prospera's SEZ because it violated citizen sovereignty. But this is now there is something like a 50-year lease on the island of Rotan in Honduras, where the SEZ was set up. And so now the Honduran government is being sued for $11 billion by Prospera. And you should know that in total there are 5 ISDS cases against the Honduran government right now.
So even those that oppose it,
the Supreme Court actually
eventually face really appalling opposition.
This is what I meant earlier about how these secret corporate justice courts, they bypass domestic courts of other countries. So, the information won't even be publicly available. It takes place, the arbitration takes place behind closed doors. So $11 billion, that's like 2/3 of the Honduran economy. So it's just all moving towards absolute total disaster. And it is insane that the MSM are not covering this and just joining the dots like a few of us have been doing for the last 8 years or so. Trying to expose it as much as possible. The only solution, in my opinion, is we need to interconnect all these different areas across the UK. This is why I've been doing these talks online and flying over to Scotland or London or South Devon or whatever, and just standing up face to face with you guys and saying, like in Liverpool, I said, okay, it's great this meeting took place. The room was alive and electric, but at the end of it, I said, look, it cannot just stop tonight. We need to, the next move, the only move is grassroots coordination across the whole of the country. With these small independent anti-SEZ Freeport campaign groups, this is how you're going to do it. And it's been proven by people like the Zapatista movement in South America. They had enough of there was no left, there was no right as such. It was a unit party for the far right, and pardon my French, they said, "Fuck it, we're going to make our own government," and they did. And now a similar thing is happened where they the funny thing is they've gone and basically set up their own zone, but it's more a socialist kind of zone, which is interesting, to protect itself from the kind of predations of capital. I mean, the most lucrative line of business in the world right now is between corporations and governments. So, like I say, there's a lot of, I mean, I find myself scrolling through parliamentary meetings, with Badenoch and what's his name, Mark Drakeford, and you just look at the kind of language that they are using. I mean, Mark Drakeford knew of the risks, but this is where it gets interesting because a lot of councils, and I've spoken with people like in Plymouth, Devon Council, a man called Jim Funnell, who is on Twitter, a fantastic guy. We've done meetings together. Now he's shown us evidence of the LEPs and the Freeport entities. They start ping-ponging between each other when FOIs are put to them, and it's about deflecting blame and just kicking the can down the road to avoid any sense of responsibility or transparency. So the only way we can do this is we have to link up and we have to make a momentum. I'm one person. They say I'm probably the only person in the UK who's really kind of focusing in on this and exposing it.
I mean, you remember the Green Party?
Yeah.
And what's the Green Party's position?
Absolutely opposed. Jeremy Corbyn also opposed. Green Party opposed to SEZs, and that's why I joined them last year. I know for a fact they are 100%. Now that the TUC and the RNT say they are also against free zones. But I don't see much momentum in terms of how close we are getting to all those zones becoming fully operational. Some of them are operational. You see the example in Teesside, and Private Eye have been all over that. And you can see it's just absolute corruption,
Thank you. And is there any other questions that people have? I can't see anybody indicating, so...
Someone called Atta?
Oh, is Atta have you got your hand up, Atta?
He's on mute.
If you unmute, come in.
I'm trying. Yes. Am I there?
There you
are.
Oh,
yes.
Yeah, there you
right. Hi. This is a question, unfortunately, it's simply put. I hope you forgive me, because I'm just trying to explain this to myself and understand it. All these SEZs, eventually what you're basically saying is that they actually take over the whole nation.
Yeah.
With contracts, I presume.
Yeah.
Long-term contracts with government, i.e. with us, taxpayers. So it's going to be, after a while, near impossible. Whatever government comes in will have to follow on, because if we renege on these contracts, would we have to pay sort of a penalty for coming out of these contracts? Therefore, they own us.
Right.
And they can actually crash the economy.
Yeah.
Would that be a fair sort of a...
Yeah, I mean, there is the other solution. So there's two solutions: grassroots activism, an interconnected, cross-country kind of network that needs to be set up, or you align the license agreements with EU regulations. But like I said, there is a problem within that because these things have been signed up to for 25 years. So it's an absolute mess. But this is why, if there is a national outcry about this and enough momentum, um, I mean, I can't predict what's going to happen, but so far it doesn't look good.
Oh, thank you. But does that mean that we really, because we're under these contracts, we would have to pay these companies if, we sort of push them away?
Absolutely, yes. No doubt whatsoever.
Thank you.
Gabriel, you've got your hand up. You've unmuted.
Yeah. Quickly. I mean, it helps me see why the British state and media and party, of the main political parties, politicians hate countries like China, Russia, Iran, etc., and attack at every opportunity the idea of a multipolar world and BRICS as well, because that is an answer to the extension of these, free economic trade zones and eventually taking over the country. It's a new form of colonialism, isn't it? And
yes.
I think those countries and, pacts or whatever are actually, a way of countering these moves of corporate, imperial, sort of financial bastards. So get technical now. Sorry.
Would it be true to say that, though, that some of these BRIC nations themselves are embracing? I mean, my understanding is that China is quite interested in developing these kind of ideas to encourage a kind of an internal capitalism within China, which is nominally, in inverted commas, a socialist country.
Yeah.
Is that correct? That China, for example, is itself embracing these notions of free ports and special economic zones?
Well, the thing with China is that they were the SEZs, like in Shenzhen and Guangzhou, they were supported, they were completely funded by the state. But so, if you see, say, a picture of Singapore, you're going to get that beautiful skyline, right? At night, the beautiful city, this kind of thing. But behind that, you've got like the actual people, the human capital that is involved, who are absolutely in poverty, have no democratic say in any kind of. There's no union, there's no dispute, there's basically no democracy. It's just one party. So it's a funny picture. The state did fund these things, and they did use the template of, islanding off sections of the country for economic growth. But at the end of the day, you've got a glossy picture that looks very nice, but behind it, it's like the Potemkin village, behind it, there's nothing. There's just barren. It's empty. Everything is just cutouts. Everything is just images of prosperity and growth and things like this. But
so again, you've got in a sense almost a return to 19th century capitalism.
Yeah.
where the people are in poverty, but there's economic growth and development and factories, but they're all but it's a return almost to appalling conditions for ordinary people.
And I just wanted, because I don't know how much longer we've got, but there's two more books.
I was just about to wind up, actually.
Okay.
Please take the last few minutes to kind of wind up.
So my main three books for finding out about SEZs is this one by Matt Kennard and Claire Provost. I hope you can see it. Called Silent Coup: How Corporations Overthrew Democracy. Now, this is an amazing book. It's basically the authors take journeys around a huge bunch of special economic zones around the world. Okay? Have everyone got that? I thoroughly recommend it. These are my go-to books. The next book is called Crack Up Capitalism: A World Without Democracy by a man called Quinn Slobodian. He's an American historian. This book is incredible. This is the one that really delves into the Thatcher years and, with extensive research into special economic zones at that time and also where they are going today. And then there's another book called Adventure Capitalism by Raymond Crabe, and he digs into the history of special economic zones. Again, bringing them up to date, where they came from. For me, those books are absolutely essential reading. I wouldn't be able to tell you half of what I tell you today without those books.
Thank you very much indeed. I think that's a really good point to end on for further reading and research, and to begin to understand what's happening here, to take what you said today further.
Yeah.
So I'm really pleased that you've come to visit us in Wellingborough today, and given us some really, really good insights into the way capitalism is now moving.
Yeah.
And as Tony mentioned, although he's gone, that the Trump government seems to be moving this a stage further of actually creating the US as a special economic zone.
Yeah.
And doing away with all regulation,
yeah,
labor rights, environmental protections, and what have you. So we'll wait and see what happens. But thank you very much tonight.
Thank you, Paul,
for coming. And
thank you, everybody.
Yeah. So without further ado, I'm going to close the meeting now. But please show your usual. Thanks. And but please,
thank you, everyone.
If I can ask everybody to stay online, though, except yourself. If everyone else could stay online for a few minutes while we give some notices of future meetings and what's happening. But you're very welcome to stay, David. But if you want to leave, please, feel free to do so. But I'm going to stop.
I'm going to say goodbye. I really enjoyed meeting you guys again. It would be hopefully maybe in the not too distant future, I can come by, meet you guys face to face. I would love that.
Excellent.
Okay, take care. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Bye bye.
Bye, everybody. I'm going to switch off recording now.